Hi, Misha. How's it going?
Great, Michael. Great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. So, what do you make of this latest coronavirus variant?
I think it's interesting for a few reasons. I mean, we're recording now on the 29th, so we've probably had a weekend of kind of news and havoc. I've got a personal interest in this. I've got a family trip booked to South Africa and Namibia for a big family safari holiday, which has kind of blown up. It looks like. So I'm quite vested. I think. All the information to date, has been like an enormous amount of noise to signal. Like I think everything I read, people, they're talking about specifications which don't matter, like deletions and mutations that no one really cares about. And no one can answer the basic questions of how dangerous is it and the like. And to be fair, no one really knows, but I think people are making a pretty big deal about it. I think it's probably like if there's enough smoke like around its rate of contagion or something. I think it's kind of fair enough to kind of go pretty harsh as early as you can until if this is like a super bug, some kind of super dangerous thing. Who knows? And I don't have a good sense for, I don't have a good prize for my expectation for it to be more or less dangerous. So I think that's kind of fair. I think it's interesting though that no one's talking about the things that matter, and all the symptoms so far seem to be pretty mild, and everyone who's vaccinated seems to be kind of okay. So I do wonder if it's a storm in a teacup at this time, albeit it's okay to kind of react hard early. Like I like Israel just shutting its borders, like it's just
Hmm.
done as a fair response. I think that the test will be over the next few weeks how quickly governments can turn the ship and kind of be sensible about it, which I'd be interested. Hopefully, very quickly, so I can go on my trip to South Africa. But I can't doubt that. What do you think?
I did notice the cases they had here were all asymptomatic. So, it's just one of those ones where
Yeah,
you don't even know you have it in most
yeah,
cases. And it's interesting how it's kind of taken the usual path that you'd expect, which is more contagious, less dangerous with time. That's like the traditional trajectory of a
yeah.
virus. Now, there's no guarantees. Things can mutate in more harmful ways, and there's definitely historical examples. But the vast majority is, the more people a virus goes through, the more it adapts to people, the better it gets at spreading, and also the less harmful it gets. It doesn't do it doesn't do a virus any evolutionary good if it has you coughing and spluttering away. Or in the worst case, passing out and not being able to infect lots of people. So far it seems all in line with what you'd expect it to happen. And I do agree, I mean, everyone's just taking these like long list of mutations and trying to make a storm in a teacup. There's just so many people that are heavily invested in your lockdowns and making sure that all the political decisions and editorial decisions of the last 2 years are justified. It's very hard for people to kind of step away from that.
I think that's right. I think when you have low evidence and low information, you have a lot of signal. What you do see is the kind of course of vested interests, and so you do see everyone who's kind of made a voice for themselves, trying to maintain relevance and maintain importance. Obviously, newspapers are kind of in the business of that as well. And you're right, you kind of have people with, in certain battle formations, ideological battle formations, trying to figure out how to kind of map it onto the existing biases. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think last week was a pretty shaky one for market. But most of the sell-off was kind of before the variant hit the headlines. It seemed to be more to do with rising rates, the rising inflation, and also the end or slowing down the tapering of quantitative easing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have strong views on like particular like on like last week's. I've got views on the broader macro. Like I'm not a native public markets guy, and I think often narratives kind of fit the event. So you'll have a crash, and then everyone will say it's XYZ, and no one really knows if it's XYZ. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of those things. I think inflation's obviously a big issue, and again, I'm kind of I don't think anyone really knows what's going on. I think if you ask 10 macroeconomists, they'll give you 10 answers about what that means. And so I kind of suspect in 50 or 100 years, if you look back at this period, there'll be a certain narrative around description of the ideology in which macroeconomists kind of thought during this period, and how that was kind of wrong for whatever reason, as every previous period was kind of wrong or kind of follows certain fashion. So, and that includes me, like, as in, I'm very skeptical of having my own kind of deep views on this. I think, though, obviously, we've seen a very long, multi-decade, certainly, and maybe multi-century decline in interest rates, and that's kind of the punchline here. So if we are seeing rising rates, and you're seeing some rising rates in kind of the peripheral economies like Australia and the UK, etc., and so potentially in the US, that obviously has pretty meaningful implications for asset valuations. And so how does something trade at 60 times revenue? That kind of valuation you'd expect is possible, not just on the back of its growth, but because future cash flows are basically discounted at a very, very low interest rate implicitly. And so if that kind of increases, you obviously see present valuations decline. I think kind of very, very, very toppy valuations and kind of persistent cash flows potentially become discounted at higher high interest rates over time. Whether we are seeing, like, what the story around inflation is, there's obviously the whole crypto narrative that the US dollar is being devalued and this is the end of empire. And I mean, I don't think it's like false necessarily. It's kind of hard to I find it personally hard to kind of go all in on that kind of story. And then I think in terms of the broader inflationary story, I think everyone's been crying wolf about inflation for like at least a decade, probably longer for people with longer corporate memories. And so it's always hard to know who's right or wrong based on who happened to be still crying wolf over the last year. What do you think?
Well, it basically got to the point where the last people that were crying wolf were out. Our favorite macro trade was to bet on rising rates, and it just didn't work for decades. And there were multiple funds that had to wind up because when markets were rallying and they were losing money because they had this incorrect trade on. And then it seems like coronavirus, it kind of had a last hurrah in 2018. Rates started rising and then obviously ended up falling. And just started to be rising again, and then coronavirus came and then wiped all those traders out. So there seemed to be nobody left of the old school macro rates are rising inflation crowd. Until of course it happened and you get these 6-7% inflation prints. But that's a story as old as markets. They'll go in one direction until the last person throws in the towel.
My favorite, this is a great chart that kind of follows forward interest rate predictions, and you kind of get this furry looking chart, all these upward curves, and the actual rates have kind of continued to decline over time. My personal story is I was working with a fund administration business like at the start of my career, around 10 years ago or so, and it's highly leveraged effectively. It's got a float, and so it's highly leveraged. Its income's highly leveraged to interest rates. And every banker in the city and every forecast, like, it's going to go up. It's absolutely fine. And this business has just kind of trundled along. It's been hard, obviously, for the last decade, because that's obviously just been wrong. So I think narratives are always backfitted and like nobody knows.
Yeah, really difficult. I actually came across a really interesting company the other day. It's called Silvergate. Basically, it's a crypto company. It's very leveraged to higher interest rates. So what they do is they've got some of the major exchanges and major stable coins to sign up to them, basically, to manage the US dollar cash. And so this is like USDC, all these stable coins that are supposed to be backed dollar for dollar. And these ones are actually backed dollar for dollar. They need to transfer US dollars between themselves, and they don't want to use payment rails. So they all store it with this one random company in the US. And basically they do it all for free. It's like a spreadsheet, they just say the US dollars no longer belongs to this person, they belong to that person. And they've all had to sign up. They've done DD on each customer. It's like very hard to get in, but once you're in, super easy to transfer large amounts of USD in between each other. And they don't charge anything for that, but they've got these tens of billions of dollars USD sitting there. So every 1% interest rate, makes real money for them. But I thought it was pretty ironic that at the heart of these USD stablecoins and basically the largest crypto fiat exchanges, you had this one company that had created this payment network. That was nothing to do with crypto at all.
But that's super interesting. I mean, crypto is like a bundle of potential solutions versus kind of current ideas and capabilities. One clear use case for crypto is it effectively automates a whole bunch of the financial system and kind of cuts out intermediaries. And so here you're kind of creating intermediaries. So it's a bit of a paradox, but why shouldn't you have, like, if you look at the current administration companies that basically do that, they're enormously bloated. They send out letters. They've got these old systems from like 20 years ago, and you've got this implied overhead. And if you can essentially have a trusted ledger and kind of automate that through algorithms, basic, call that crypto, if you want, why shouldn't that all be automated? And if their cream is the interest rates, that kind of makes sense, and that's kind of neat. So you kind of see this deflationary effect really in financial services. So to be honest, that kind of totally makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's still unbelievably difficult to move money around and do that kind of thing. I mean, we do it all the time. I mean, the settlements for trading, dealing with investor cash, investor flows, the fact that it can be instant or just take a few days, you don't know. There's no easy way to look it up. It's amazing how far there is to go. Are you a believer in Web3 and all the excitement around that?
I mean, at its heart, I'm a huge believer. Like, I don't feel native to it. Like, I'm not some, developer who's hacking away at night, and I haven't been invested since like 2012 or something. So I'm part of this kind of, new wave of interested, lay people really in finance. And I think believing in it and believing, that it's going to be big is totally compatible with thinking there's a whole bunch of bullshit and there's like Ponzi's everywhere you kind of look, which is kind of fun, to be honest, to kind of be in this strange universe. And so one thing on the Ponzi issue, I found it interesting to think about. I've got very far thinking about it, but clearly some of these, a lot of crypto products and platforms have a Ponzi aspect to them where they're kind of relying on growth and new entrants effectively to kind of bootstrap it up. But I wonder if at some point the question is, at what point does it either cease to be a Ponzi, and it's kind of either becomes something else, however you want to kind of frame a legitimate business or enterprise or platform, or can it be a Ponzi forever without the crash? And I think you could do a nice anatomy of Ponzi's, which I haven't done. And I know Ben Hobart wrote a recent newsletter kind of touching on this, but like Australian housing in some respects is a Ponzi, but it may well kind of persist forever. Or
yeah, I mean, like a Ponzi, to me Ponzi is very specific. It's a very specific kind of fraud. But pretty much every financial asset is bought with the ability and to potentially sell it at a later date. So I think there's some element of confusion where people think, oh, just because you're buying something and you're relying on the fact you can sell it to somewhere else, that is a Ponzi. And then you're able to use all those awful fraudulent connotations of Ponzi and put that label on any asset that people are buying just because they think they'll be able to sell it at a later date. That's like the whole difference between, that's like what liquidity is all about. That's why you have like private equity funds. They're completely different species to, public listed market funds. So I don't know, they're just my initial thoughts on the Ponzi. I feel like it's a very overused word and it's like a very specific type of fraud, but I don't think it necessarily applies to every asset that people buy with the hope or expectation at some point they'll be able to sell it on to somebody else.
I think that's true, but I think, when I refer to Australian housing, for example, you are kind of relying on, the growth of new money and new entrants to kind of go in to sustain prices in the way you have, and given where leverage is as well in the system, that kind of feels like maybe you're stretching the Ponzi label a little bit, but kind of feels apt. Someone's trying to sell me on, this new, I won't name it, but this kind of new currency and this new token really. And it literally, I kind of stripped away all the jargon around it, and I said, is this how the economics work? And he said, well, no, if it worked like that, that would be a Ponzi. But actually, it's because it's being attached to this new rail system, and it's going to increase demand for this token. I'm saying, well, why would it increase demand for the token? Well, it's got an extremely high APY, like a yield effectively of over 1,000 in that token. And so it becomes like highly self-referential. And I don't think these guys are frauds or crooks or anything. And like, it may work in the end, but it does strike me that there it did just look like a classic Ponzi, to be honest. But then at some point, if it becomes a big enough part of the market, maybe it'll buy itself time to become something else.
Yeah, there is an element of that. So I feel like Tether's like that. So everyone, I'm always getting certain things about Tether, and they've clearly done all kinds of kind of trickery and almost certainly fraud, and they got slapped on the wrist by New York regulators. They told everyone they hold US dollars. They're now admitting they don't hold US dollars. Like, that means every statement has been false. But now it's like this huge enterprise. So it would have started so spivvy and fraudulent, got to some crazy $70-80 billion scale, maybe more, maybe less, but certainly of that magnitude. And I can just see the founders like scrambling to legitimize themselves as fast as they possibly can.
It's a great example of that. So, and you kind of see that everywhere. But I don't know. I just find it interesting that I think I'm very bullish Web3. I think in the same way that you could be very excited by the internet in the 90s, and a lot of people were probably still underrating it. I think people are still, like, my fundamental view on it is that 10 years ago and 20 years ago, people were fundamentally underrating the importance of the internet and our digital lives, and how everything or many things would be meaningfully touched by that. And I think this is just an extension of that. This is just kind of native digital currencies, native digital networks, and the like. And so I think we probably still underestimate the impact of the internet. And I think this is just a natural evolution for it to go, rather than Facebook and Google kind of controlling the user experience and all the compute within their walled gardens. You have distributed compute across the world, and I think that's enormously exciting.
Yeah, I just can't believe how much value those kind of middle people kind of accrued. And to me, I've said it before on this podcast, Spotify is just such a good example. We don't necessarily care about Spotify. We want to listen to music from artists. And Spotify pays them nothing, but they've created $50 billion of equity market value, which is a serious amount of money. Like, they could go very far. They could fund a lot of musicians, with $50 billion. It's being captured by a small number of venture capitalists, early investors, founders, and there's this $50 billion gap between what the listeners are willing to pay effectively and what the creators get. It just seems like it's possible to reorder all those things. And the fact that crypto is so good for speculation makes it really good for crowdfunding, for new business models, for new governance models, for things like that. You can do a lot of, even if it just stays like a speculative asset class, but is used to fund new ways of doing things that kind of capture those tens and actually hundreds. Actually, if you include things like Instagram and Facebook, where everybody posts content for free, you're talking about trillions of dollars of value that is captured by a very small group of companies, which could potentially be shared amongst the people posting and the people consuming content.
I mean, some people criticize crypto for not having like real world use cases, and kind of just bootstrapping a parallel $1 trillion parallel financial system with like no use case. But I think starting with bootstrapping $1 trillion financial system is like a pretty good place to start.
What was the company I was looking at recently? DLocal. So we don't own it, but it's like growing super fast. It helps people do international payments. Somewhere like, I don't know, the Philippines or South America, it's very hard to actually get Spotify. You have to go and buy Spotify payment cards in a supermarket. Because,
I didn't know that.
Because they can't, they'll only accept US American credit cards. They won't do it from around the country, and they've created this huge business over that. And it's like, it's unbelievable today. And this is not something that's like, this is the disruptor. This is the company that's coming in and making it all digital. And it's literally that bad. Haven't quite got to the bottom of it. Still need a bit of work on that company. And don't feel any enormous pressure with respect to time, because it's one of these extremely rich companies. I mean, the multiples halve, but it's still, on an absolute basis, extremely expensive. People in many countries in the world have to jump through extraordinary numbers of hoops just to access Spotify, just to pay YouTube. Amazon uses them. Even companies like that, still have huge payment issues all around the world.
On your creator point, I think it was Chris Dixon who said, the internet's not bad for creators. Kind of Web 2, this era of the internet has been terrible for creators, but Web 3 and the internet can be amazing for creators. To your point, if you can kind of disintermediate Spotify and go direct to your artist. I mean, people like music has got to be one of the biggest areas of fan love. I would love to have a more direct relationship with the musicians and the artists whom I love, rather than, as you say, being ferried through Spotify or whomever and kind of allowing them to capture all the value. So, and that's that's one example. I mean, creators, so to speak, or the creator economy, or whatever, like artists, musicians, like it's not like the economy. It's a small part of the economy. But I think I think that model and different models will be replicated across broader parts of the economy.
You're right. It's a small part of the economy, but it's a huge part of what makes lives rich and enjoyable, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's what this is all about. So I think I don't think, I'm not a crypto is going to own the world kind of guy. I think, many parts of the world, my wife's Mexican. Every time I go to Mexico, like parts of Mexico, like the internet hasn't arrived yet. Like, I think everything will coexist, big corporate, Spotify will exist, crypto will exist, traditional finance will exist, traditional governments will exist wherever you go. But I think it's unbelievably exciting that you're getting technology is enabling an exit or new pathways, new communities to be built, new governance mechanisms, and people are experimenting, and they will recreate and make a lot of the same mistakes that have been created in the past. But I think through human history, every item from like the hammer to the axe to the wheel, whatever, has gone through all these iterative phases to go from where it started to where it ended up, and kind of spawned new tools along the way. And so I think we're going to same thing with institutional governance frameworks, with financial systems and the like. And that's enormously exciting that we get to be a part of that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I saw that phrase. I was reading something about like reinventing the wheel. Maybe it was a meme, about like they found these like carts that were 6,000 years old. So you could see these old school ways of doing wheels. And I was like, yeah, reinventing the wheel. It had to be reinvented many times. Like there's a long way from that to like a bicycle tire with spokes and like layers of rubber and tubing. And
I know a recent innovation of the wheel. And I think this is shocking that in 2020s, this is what's happening. So I ride a road bike, and I'm gonna like get the terminal. Like I ride my bike. I'm not like a big bike head, who kind of knows all the terminology. So your
judgment here. You can,
but your viewers are gonna be like, you got this part all wrong or whatever. So I'm kind of caveating at the start. But I about a few years ago, this is within the last 5 years. So this is hyper recent. They basically discovered that if you ride a slightly wider tire on your bike and at a lower pressure, you'll actually go faster and it's more efficient. And so that is like a zero cost innovation. It's meaningful, like it's not just like super marginal, like it's meaningful. And this is after I don't know how many billions of dollars have gone into R&D over the last 40 years to improve road bikes. Like they've changed dramatically, but they've only discovered this most trivial step up in performance over the last 5 years. And so someone should write that up in detail, like exactly what they found and how that works. But I find that I'm still shocked, because I think that just shows the nature of progress. And you've probably got all these kind of low-hanging fruits lying around, and someone's tinkering it, and then or everyone gets herded down this kind of herd mentality path. I mean, the story of the combustion engine versus the electric battery, things could have gone very differently 120 years ago. It's total path dependence, and we're driving around with these combusting, like exploding things in our cars, which is kind of weird when you kind of had electricity for all that time. So I mean, I think like the future is not kind of determined, and I think there are $100 bills lying around in terms of innovation and progress.
Yeah, what was the classic one? Yeah, it was like it took them ages to figure out to put wheels on luggage. Like that's a relatively recent. That's like living memory. People just carry bags around.
That's a great example. Or I mean, I was reading about the Mexican society's pre-colonization, and they didn't have the wheel. and they were like these people built cities
Are you
that
talking about Aztec or Maya? Or?
we're talking about Aztecs, as I understand, Aztecs is a bit of a misnomer. It's like a triple alliance of different kind of communities or empires, and it was all kind of, they're all like killing each other and conquering each other. It was all, but they were hyper sophisticated. So the soldiers, the Spanish soldiers that arrived, and they had seen Rome, they had seen the Ottomans, they had seen the best of what Europe had to offer, were shocked at the advanced technology of these cities on the water, and they thought it was unbelievable. So these were advanced societies that had built what they had built, without the wheel, for example. And so it just shows kind of the what else, we're seeing one universe, but what and in some respects we're seeing, in terms of our current society, and we're seeing hyper development along some axes, but I'm sure that there are like axes upon which we're relatively underdeveloped, which are fairly low hanging, so to speak.
Yeah, and I never forget, I went to Mexico City a couple of times because I have a friend there. And I went to the museum there and they had this enormous slab that they did human sacrifices on. And you can just see this thing, it's the size of like 2 dinner tables, but like solid rock. The whole thing was terrifying. I'll never forget that. Do you have you spent much time in Mexico?
To be honest, I don't know how many times I've been there. Probably 10 times or something so far. And often it's like wrapped up in family stuff. So, but we have road tripped around a little bit. But there's a book, Fire and Blood, which I'm kind of referring to now, which I just highly recommend. It's totally non-finance or investing related. It's just the kind of history of Mexico from the dawn of time till like the 90s. And so I think there should be more books written like that. But I mean, with the whole sacrifice thing, I think it's interesting watching other societies ossify and become sclerotic, which is kind of what the Aztecs had become when the Spaniards rocked up. So kind of coupled with that kind of poor governance structure. Like, for example, they had these fake wars where they, the real wars and kind of real animal, real kind of spirit of battle had ossified into these fake wars where they'd rock up and it was highly ceremonial and they'd just exchange sacrifice victims basically for the purpose of appeasing their gods. And so they'd kind of got stuck in this local minimum basically in terms of like institutional or religious or social technology, if you want to frame it that way. And so it became kind of rife for disruption by the Spaniards, who came along with bringing disease, obviously, and cannons and the like, just basically with a very small number of men destroyed an empire of millions. And so I mean I think those lessons are instructive, and I think we're seeing that today in technology and what can happen with a few focused people looking at the right opportunity.
This Mexico is interesting, it's just that there's so many different elements to it. Surf cultures in one small bit, which I obviously spent a bit of time in. Then you've got Mexico City, that crazy high altitude. And then you've got that drug war that was just so violent from the outside in a country where there's 100 million plus people just living their lives.
It's always hard to know exactly what's going on. And I think, I get snippets of news from my wife. I don't follow it super close, but she's like, have you seen what the president's done? And it like the political culture and the political economy there is like, I'm so grateful for what we have in Australia. It's like pretty boring, basically. And whereas there, it's like total insanity, running amok, and corruption, and you never know how big the narco threat is, and which states are effectively under the government's control versus not in the government's control. And so, but I mean, one really interesting thing I noticed comparing Australia to Mexico, and I might write something up about this, but one of the original, I don't know what the opposite of an original sin in Australia is, but like one of the great features that were kind of bestowed in terms of governance and institutions in Australia was the distribution of land, and it was kind of widely distributed, and it wasn't kind of controlled by a few families, like Argentina across and like a lot of Latin America, and that basically created a more egalitarian society, and the wealth was kind of more broadly distributed, and here we are. Whereas in Mexico, fights over land and who's owning land, from the church to big landowners, to, has been one of the causes of revolutions and fighting for like 300 years, and it's kind of persisting today in terms of the industrial class and the like. And so you can kind of see these original sins at the formation, which are very hard to kind of unwind, subsequently, or leads to like meaningful conflict and violence.
So is the argument that they were more diverse in terms of land ownership, so more conflict but less ossified?
In Mexico
Versus relative to other parts of South America?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the church ended up owning a lot, and then rich landowners ended up owning a lot, and so a lot of other power centers felt disenfranchised, basically, and so they kept fighting over, and rather than a new system being in place, it was like say goodbye to the old boss, say hello to the new boss kind of dynamic, where you just had new landowners coming in and kind of the conflicts kind of continuing in cycle. Whereas in Australia, I think one thing that the British endowed on a lot of their colonies, it was effectively systems of governance and institutions that persisted and were amenable to change and distributed wealth somewhat relative to other colonies. And you kind of see the impact that has on kind of wealth creation over time. This is the kind of my layperson's view. I don't know how we kind of got stuck on this tangent, but it's one thing that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, and I love that stuff. I remember reading an essay on Argentina versus Australia 100 years ago. So same wealth, same kind of, what's the right word? Latitude, longitude?
Yeah.
I guess latitude. Both have immense natural resources, different set of issues like agrarian economies at the time, mining. And I think the conclusion was there are a few, and again, it's probably like a layman's simplification, but it seemed to ring true because they then expanded that point to other countries. It was kind of in Argentina, there were these big landholding families, which you were alluding to, which meant the height of cool was to be sitting in Buenos Aires and not work.
That's right.
And the English had that as well, and that like pervades the English society as well. So it was cool to be a lord and write a play in your spare time, do a little bit of art. It's like the upper class does science, in a lab full of technicians. The lower class did all the engineering stuff and all the industrial revolution, and in some societies, like America, Australia, effectively, Canada, they're industrious, free working, whereas there's other societies that don't have those as their core values. The core value is to be wealthy, to sit on your wealth, and to not get your hands too dirty, and to be in the capital and live a life of luxury. I thought that was quite interesting.
There's a great book called Albion, which tracks the 4 different waves of migrants that came to the US from their places of origins in England, and the dramatically different cultures they had, from like the Virginians to the Protestants and to people going to Appalachia from the Scottish Irish borderlands and so on, and it talks exactly about that, like what they prized relatively in terms of what was high status and low status, in terms of work ethic, in terms of how they lived, in terms of the language they used and the like. And so I think it cuts along those exact lines. We had these Virginian plant owners who, their purpose was to kill time, so to speak, and show how great
American
that was.
South versus American North.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Versus, the Protestant ethic, where it's not about being showy; it's about working really hard. And so, I think that's super interesting. One book I read that covered, which I think is excellent, and your viewers might be interested, was Why Australia Prospered. I think it's by Ian McLean from memory, and it does exactly what you described. It kind of, it asks why has Australia prospered for 100 years, obviously. It compares to Argentina and other economies explicitly to try and answer that, which I thought was really interesting.
I guess the challenge then is to draw that lens. It's one thing to compare different countries 100 years ago and see outcomes. What if you turn that lens onto like our society today? What are we valuing? Which is that pushing us in the right or the wrong direction? That'd be an interesting question.
Well, I found I annoy a lot of my friends and my colleagues when I talk about this exact question, because I think as I've been reading more and more kind of history, to be honest, I could kind of say that it's for investment reasons or whatever. It's just because it's interesting and it's kind of fun. But it's kind of changed my perspective on that. And I think reading about dramatically different countries or periods of time gives you a better sense for water you are swimming in today, and what are our current fashions, and what are our current kind of social derangements, and what is kind of broken today, because you can kind of assume that there's probably an equal amount wrong today as there was in the past, and that we're kind of generally equally subject to herd mentality and subject to all our biases as in the past. So when I do point out things that just seem really weird today, and there's like heaps that's weird, and it'll probably get weirder.
What are some examples?
I'll give you one example which I think's pretty weird, which I've kind of spoken a fair bit on my podcast about, but I find it really strange that today the polite public and very majoritarian discourse around child rearing is that we ought to increase childcare and get more people working. And I just, and explicitly, to be honest, to kind of allow more women and mothers to work. And I find the whole conversation super weird. I think like in one respect, it reminds me of the kibbutzim. So the kibbutzim were these socialist communes in Israel, and everyone kind of worked the land, and they all pooled their children together and basically said, we'll raise them anonymously. It's all kind of fungible, so to speak, and like there was no disaster story there, but it didn't really work for whatever reason. But I kind of find it strange that hyper-modern capitalism and socialism converge on outsourcing your children to these centers. And I find it strange that we're making it a virtue of going out and working more and working longer and outsourcing child rearing versus parents having more family time, and versus parents raising their children more. And it's very strange that we're saying, well, we need to, childcare is super expensive, so we should subsidize it, and parents should go out more, and in order to be able to afford more childcare. And the whole thing's like really strange and circular. We're not really asking the questions of actually maybe it's a good thing for parents to raise their children, and is it a better thing just to kind of increase workforce participation for the sake of it?
I've noticed that it does seem to be very society does seem to be very anti having kids when you're younger. I'm like kind of, I guess, 33, no children. You have children, don't you?
Yeah, so I'm 33 as well. And I could like rant at you forever about this, but I've got like 3 kids under 5 now. And so I've got I think I had my first kid when I was 20 or 29, which is, old to, normal for like, basically any period of time before like 30 years ago or something. And today it's like, I'm by far the youngest guy when I go to childcare or school or whatever, interact with other parents. And I do find it strange. You see this across the world. In Australia, it's like not the worst, but you're seeing across the world, declining fertility rates and the like. And I do wonder what that says about our culture and our values. And we're turning into societies who don't want to replicate themselves, and that at the most fundamental level don't value life and the creation of life. And so I know I might sound like a loony, like conservative. I kind of sound like a loony conservative to myself sometimes on the stuff, but I just find it very strange that we're like, okay, that's great. Let's just like not have any more kids. And I think as a society, we should decide whether we're agnostic to the question, which I think, Australians probably tend to be pretty agnostic to the question, or whether actually we think it's good and to center family and kids culturally. So what are your plans? Are you you're part of the guilty here. And look, all my friends, I'm by far the youngest of all my friends, with kids, and most of my close friends don't have kids, and they're and they're older. So
look, I have a few friends. I do have a few friends that have now have kids. They're mostly kind of like 0, 1, 2, that kind of age. I think in my 20s, I think it's more like a self-centered thing. You're kind of focusing on yourself, and I feel like if you have kids, it kind of like forces you not to do that. And so I look back, like, I think pretty much every decision I made in my 20s was to some degree self-centered, which sounds bad, but, I thought it was like, move here because it'd be the best thing for my career, do this job, set up this fund, 5 years ago, focus on that. You're always thinking kind of about yourself. And I feel like looking back and when I was younger, I still obviously do that all the time, but a little bit more self-aware. In your 20s, you do that, you don't even realize. But I do think if if you did have kids, and I guess it can happen to anybody anytime, it probably would have got me out of my own head a bit sooner in that regard. That's the only comment. That's a pretty personal comment. I've never talked about that stuff on a podcast.
I'm glad I got to listen to that out of you. I mean, I found it super transformative personally, but it's always hard to know, like, there's a whole decision theory kind of, theories about this, but it's always hard to choose a different set of preferences for your future self, so to speak. So like, there's nothing inherently, you could argue there's nothing inherently better about the post-kids value system versus the pre-kids value system. And how do you kind of choose that? But I guess as a society, and maybe I'm just talking about book because I have kids, and so you should distrust what I'm saying. But as a society, I have moved towards a view that, I'd rather live in one that centered kids and family formation more. And there's a whole system around this. I criticize, and I'm the first who's guilty. I kind of criticize the increased atomization that we're living in. We kind of travel to different cities away from our parents, and we don't live in the kind of notional village anymore. And I'm the most guilty. I'm an immigrant to this country when I was very little, and I grew up in Adelaide, and I moved to the big smoke in Sydney for my finance. And I'm absolutely the kind of example one of this kind of the manifestation of this culture. But now, after I've had kids, I'm thinking, wow, like structurally, kids are way further away from their grandparents, and my wife as well. She's kind of this global person from Mexico. I met her here, so now her family's in Mexico. And how does that actually work? And is that ultimately healthier for larger portions of society? Grandparents to be split from grandchildren and from kids, and I mean, these are really big issues, and I don't know how to even begin to kind of untangle them, but they seem to be like, I don't think we've done this before. I think it's a big experiment that we're kind of running.
In the last few decades, last 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Actually, I thought a better way of saying than self-centered. So if let's say you're young, in your 20s, single, living by yourself, basically, which was very close to like my circumstance, every decision of like where you spend every minute of every weekend is completely up to you. You've got nothing. You don't even have like a parent's birthday to occasionally go to or anything. You're literally on your own. Foreign country, nothing. Whereas I think about my parents, they got married pretty young and had me pretty young. And just the driving on the weekend, like you just never even thought about it. It's just like, I live like in this side of Sydney, and my game is 2 hours on the other side of Sydney. So we need to leave right now. Whereas your parent then has to spend like 2 hours driving there, watch like some 8-year-olds run around a football field very poorly, in my case, and then drive like 2 hours back. I mean, comparing and contrast those, like that single foreign life versus that young family life is almost unimaginable.
I do feel like, in the most basic way, and this is like not new or profound, but like kids just provide meaning. Like when I was living that life that you're describing, like sometimes it did feel, a little hollow for me personally, and that might be a reflection on me just not being an interesting enough person or whatever. So it's always hard to kind of generalize this kind of stuff, but that was kind of my experience. And kids, certainly, as you say, that like you don't have any more questions because you're so busy. Your weekends are naturally filled up, your evenings and your days are naturally filled up. And I think I found that personally, healthy and nice, but each to their own, I guess.
Yeah, you might roll your eyes here, but I've found biggest sense of community, the most active communities I've seen, I think, in the last, other than obviously family-centered ones and cultural, religious-centered ones, have been these crypto communities. Yeah. I have an intern, very good. There's a group of uni students who until recently probably hadn't really done anything outside of, that I'm aware of anyway, outside of uni school, that structured environment. And they're doing an NFT project now, Zen Apes, and they got something like, there's like 18,000 people in their Discord chatting in a community that they're leading. And you go on this thing and literally like the messages, like it's one of those like rolling screens, like there's that much activity, and they're connecting with, head of gaming at like Blizzard and like all these like senior executives who kind of like, and I'm in the same boat. I'm like just fascinated by this community. Like I don't remember ever, I can't think of a single example of like a group of Oxford students getting together and forming a community like that. I'm sure there were examples, but in general, people might put on a play together or, form some kind of investment club with 30 people and it would kind of fizzle a bit. I never saw this like tens of thousands of people, like these young people able to form these communities of tens of thousands of people. They were just so excited and obsessed. And like you see these kids, they're red-eyed, they haven't slept, they've literally just been answering messages. It's really something, it really does feel something new, and that energy is pretty exciting to see.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've thought about it. I don't want to overfit to my biases, but I have spoken in the past before about how are NFTs a substitution for kids in some ways? There are 10,000 crypto punks.
Spend $500,000 on a
well, they're expensive.
It probably does feel like a trap.
But they're like 10,000 crypto punks, but this one is mine, and it's and it's generating, and I like this one, and there is something, in one sense you could think of it that way, and then as you say, I think kind of rise of digital communities is probably filling a gap from the decline in real life communities, from our increased atomization, the decline of like union membership and religion and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's like healthy. It's like a good thing that people are kind of yearn for this kind of community that you're describing. Or in another sense, you could think about it as an extension or a manifestation of the extended adolescence. People are like, grown men are dusting all their cash on like trading cards again, and maybe that's a negative signal. So I mean, who knows? It's probably all these things to some extent, and we'll find out.
Well, that's almost one of the universal scales, right? Like in evolution, things seem to go from being more, I think about a dog, they're either more puppy-like or more wolf-like. And that's like a spectrum that can be selected for evolutionarily. And like if you think about people, people can be very violent. That's been slowly kind of receding from like our personalities. People like that don't do very well in modern society. People that are able to stay playful and communicative and really open to new things, they're the people that have succeed in modern society, using modern society being like probably, I guess, quite a long period of time now. I think that's interesting. So it just caught my eye that you that extension of adolescence, because in a way that's been happening in multiple aspects of our lives already. And it'll be interesting, over the next 100 years, if you had to predict like what will we look like, we'll probably be childlike for longer, more playful, more open. Actually, it probably bodes well for the NFT space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I do wonder, like one perennial question I ask myself is, how much of these things can we kind of over extrapolate, and how much of these things are kind of cyclical? Like I was reading Christopher Lasch, who was writing in like the 70s, and he wrote a book, I think it was The Culture of Narcissism, which I just read. And you could take the prologue, which summarized all their issues, and it would like apply equally today.
What kind of issues was he saying was?
Let me pull it up, because let me see if I can read you directly, because I'm gonna mischaracterize it, and I think it's very apt. I'll read the start of the preface. So it says, hardly more than a quarter century after Henry Luce proclaimed the American century, American confidence has fallen to a low ebb. Those who recently dreamed of a world power now despair of governing the city of New York. Defeat in Vietnam, economic stagnation, and the impending exhaustion of natural resources have produced a mood of pessimism in higher circles, which spreads through the rest of society as people lose faith in their leaders. The same crisis of confidence grips other capitalist countries as well. In Europe, the growing strength of communist parties, the revival of fascist movements, and a wave of terrorism all testify in different ways to the weakness of established regimes and to the exhaustion of established tradition. Even Canada, has this independence issue. So, I mean, I think it kind of goes on, but you can talk about the defeat of the US in Afghanistan, our kind of concern over environmental degradation, the decline of faith in leaders and our elites. You can kind of see, when I look around the world, that's certainly the zeitgeist I kind of see in the US especially, but kind of, across the Western world. You could almost just replace some of those country names with, and it'd be highly apt. And so I don't know if things are cyclical or if everyone can kind of be pessimistic all the time and have a pessimistic frame. And so we should actually be optimistic because, you could say that, 50 years ago, and you could say that 30 years ago, you could say that 20 years ago, and actually, we're kind of going okay, or whether things have kind of persisted in that same direction, have kind of gone worse. So I don't really know what the answer is, but I found it super interesting that you could take this assessment of culture and, from 50 years ago, and it's like basically the same today. I don't know if that resonated with you or not.
I mean, it does. I think the most interesting part is the fact that there's two wars. So pretty serious parts of American society got involved in ultraviolence, and that changes. I think that changes society. Think about the horrors of World War II. That was the people who fought in World War I. A lot of people fought in the same one. And if they didn't fight in World War I, they were kids and saw people rock up with faces blown off, no legs, things like that. Like, it was a really radicalizing moment, was that ultraviolence of World War I that I think led to those excesses, or was at least partly. And you can obviously track the leaders, right? The leaders of the countries fought. Churchill was in the trenches. Hitler obviously was in the trenches as well. Those men were surrounded by violence at very young ages. Not that I'm comparing Churchill and Hitler in any way. but those societies, those people, like tens of millions of people fought in that first war and then committed the most outrageous atrocities that even vastly exceeded actually the horrors of World War I, about 20 years later. And so I think when I look at the US, and even you fly on the plane, and they'd like to thank everybody for their service. Not that there's anything unlaudable about that, but the fact that, that's constantly in your mind, that people are going away, they're having their legs blown off, they're driving cars over bombs that are blowing up. If they survive, they probably were witness to, massacres of innocent civilians by mistake, which happens again and again and again. The entire establishment feels they have the right to just bomb, and murder people without trial if they're in a foreign country. And the whole, millions of people are involved in those defense establishments. So I do think those wars that the Americans had, and actually obviously countries like Australia participated in to some degree, really must have had some pretty serious impact on society. I think that helped explain the radicalism around Trump, because a lot of his power bases was vets, and these are people that almost certainly every vet would know or heard of or been very close to, people that had died, who had committed these atrocities, and again, I'm not drawing any moral lines. Like, if you're put in those environments, I'm not casting any judgment from this seat anyway of what the right thing to do in those situations is. And who knows where those moral calculations land. But I did find it interesting that it was those veterans that had been in those violent situations where they feared for their own life, where they were up against people that were fearing them, often for very good reason, that you had such a crazy outcome. Yeah, so I think that does kind of resonate.
I mean, I'm less uncomfortable casting judgment. I think it was totally appalling that the US basically fought this endless war and cost countless, and been totally agnostic to Afghan lives and just bombed the shit out of civilians.
That I agree with. And it's still a crime. It's still a crime.
It's a total crime. And if you read the details of how they were played by various tribal lords, or it'd be farcical and funny if it weren't so savage, what they were up to.
Yeah, on that point, just to clarify, I think what I was thinking, when you have, for example, there was that scandal in Australia where there was somebody who's clearly doesn't seem like a particularly nice person, who committed atrocities and then came here and caused a bit of mischief. It was in the courts. I feel like it's very hard to pass judgment on somebody like that. If you train somebody to kill, you put them in some violent situation, and they do violent things, that I think is very hard to say what is right and wrong from the outside. But the fact that, you've got the political establishment that is killing people with drones without trial and doing such stupid things, like just step back, and all that money and lives and treasure, and you've ended up with these awful outcomes. So even if you just, you just know that those have been disastrous.
So I think that's a good example of one of the kind of public derangements, if you're sitting in 2019 or before Trump, say 2016, and you're hang on, guys, we're still in Afghanistan. What the hell's going on? What are we trying to do there? And so, or the border issue in the US. I'm not American, so maybe I shouldn't comment, but the fact that saying we should enforce our border, which we do very well in Australia, is a politically charged comment. And so you have someone like Trump coming in and saying obvious truths like what the hell are we doing in Iraq and Afghanistan? Trump's a bit of an idiot, but he happened on these like massive truths that resonated with the public, like maybe we should have a border, and maybe we should build a wall, and maybe we should not be in Iraq and Afghanistan. That just basically rode him to victory, because the political parties there are so sclerotic that they couldn't even kind of say those kinds of things. But I want to kind of go back to your comment. Like I'd push back against the experience of World War I veterans kind of causing, or kind of making them more militaristic and kind of causing World War II. In the US especially, I found it interesting that after World War I, there was such outrage at like corporate profiteering. This is their language, not my language. Over World War I, the US basically like massively wound back its military industry and its military base. And so when it was kind of going into World War II, it kind of went from like almost a start of like zero. And so you've got the famous late start but enormous ramp up of the US kind of US industry and participation in World War II. An excellent book that I loved on this is called Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman, and basically talks about how US wound back its military because it was so like thought World War I was such a waste of like money and time basically for them, and they were annoyed they were dragged in, and then it kind of had to start again for World War II. So I don't know if you can kind of link them from people being more structurally militaristic. And today I find it interesting, I think we kind of as a society outsource our violence. Like there's no conscription or anything like that, obviously. And I think the last time there was Vietnam. And so now like you're basically just sending off kind of professionalized army. People don't need to think about it too much. And so you can kind of fight this 20-year bullshit fake war on the other side of the world. And no one really like notices that much because, it's not felt it's felt strongly by some parts of society, but not kind of broadly distributed. But I think it was in World War II, I think, you had 150 Harvard staff died. I think that was a stat I read the other day. So the elite, so to speak, of society were very much vested in these wars, and they very much participated. Whereas now, no one at Harvard's kind of going to.
I don't know. I think there are. I think if you go, I guess Joe Biden's son fought in the wars, didn't he? So I know what you're saying. It's sort of at a distance. It's at a much greater distance. It's not personal.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you went to a town in the center of America somewhere, in the south of America, there might be many people that who went to high school who went down the military path.
That's right. But who in New York and how many in Washington DC or Silicon Valley have a kind of similar direct proximity to soldiers? But anyway, I forget how we kind of went down that rabbit hole, but that was fun.
Do you think there's much relevance in reading about these kinds of things, thinking about these things for the investment world?
Look, I think it's always easy to convince yourself, yes, because I like to do it. And so I'm like, oh yeah, this is really great for my whatever I'm doing professionally. So my answer is it's hard to know. I think one way that I invest is, and this is not new, and many investors obviously think about it. So, but obviously you think about the macro, and you think about, well, what really are the macro tailwinds? And macro tailwinds, we live in interesting times, and China-US conflict, where Australia sits in all that. What's been the story of the last 100 years in terms of the rise of the US? What's Australia good and bad at? What are the demographic challenges kind of being faced around the world? These kind of very big multi-decade issues. I think definitely digitization generally and what that kind of looks like, these absolutely speak to investments, investment decisions. And I think not any single one piece of information might be the clincher, but I think forming a view of where the world's come from and what world you're living in and where the world's going, I think that's absolutely relevant to investing, because I think you want to get behind the big macro tailwinds and avoid the big macro headwinds to the extent you can. So I find that way it's kind of useful. I mean, I guess aside from the whole, Web3 is coming and digitization, it's hard for me to kind of point to kind of anything specific. But for example, I am generally bullish Australia. I think the world is decentralizing away from the US relative to the last 20 years. I think we're creating, we're punching above our weight in terms of the giants we're creating, the generational companies like Atlassian and Canva and maybe Afterpay and the like. And I think that has kind of the path dependence we were talking about, that has kind of flow-on effects in terms of talent creation and training and the like. I was one of the companies that I've invested in, they're doing unbelievably well, and they basically use Atlassian as their hiring ground for engineers, as one example, and they're based in Sydney. And so I think I don't know if Australia for whatever kind of deterministic reasons was destined to kind of create these giants or not, but we have, and I think it's going to have very meaningful flow-on effect. So I don't know. I kind of take a very generalist view of knowledge. Like, I think knowledge is knowledge, and you don't need to kind of call yourself a public equities investor or a private markets investor, or private equity investor, or however you want to frame it. I think I think every opportunity kind of has its own risk return kind of dynamics, and you're betting on like something, one thing or two things or whatever they are. And I think having a clearer view of the world in which we live generally, aside from just being very interesting, and I just like doing it, I think it does inform the way I think about those kind of decisions. What do you think?
Look, I think it helps. Anything that helps you step out of the day to day is generally helpful. The more longer term you can be, the better. The thing is, you can look at history and draw the wrong lessons. For example, in the GFC, I vividly remember times where the 10-year return on equities was negative, and so that the conclusion that you take then with respect to long-term investing and now are very different. That was actually the second 50% bear market in less than a decade, because there was a 2001 as well. So that created a generation of investors who were very bearish, and then that proved precisely the wrong trade over the next 10 years. But again, zooming out, the fact that people are progressing, that technology is moving forward, that is really helpful. The fact that there's this universal human behaviour is also kind of helpful. I'd say I probably learn more from good books about people than most investing books I've read.
Like what? Which books do you like in that category?
The books that I'm a big fan of autobiographies. I think you get a good feel. A really good autobiography gives you a good feel of the trajectory that a person and often companies can take as well, and like the twists and turns in that.
I love audiobooks. Like I've massively got into the last 5 years, and aside from history books, I reckon autobiographies are like really work in that format. And just the one I'm reading right now, which I started this morning on big cycles, is Let My People Go Surfing, which is the autobiography for the founders of Patagonia. And so it literally, there's this bloke and the team basically making climbing hardware for themselves, because it just didn't really exist. And he kind of tracks from that, and their ethos and what they were solving for themselves and selling to their friends. And you can really see the craftsmanship, and you can see, in the background, implicit in the book, the kind of growth wave they're kind of riding in terms of the penetration, public consciousness of kind of activewear or specialized clothing, and really from the starting days. And so I'm not planning on investing in a necessarily in a outdoor hardware business or a new kind of clothing eco-friendly clothing company, but kind of seeing how that real passion and creative instinct and particular kind of ethos manifest into an enormously successful brand and product and company. I mean, it's endlessly fascinating. All the anecdotes are wonderful, and I think that's kind of more obviously applicable to investing, I guess. But
one book that had a huge impact on me, not just in certainly in investing and directly in the way I look at companies, but also kind of more broadly. There's a book called Emperor of All Maladies. Have you come across that?
I don't know it.
It's a history of cancer, as in like the disease cancer. That is the emperor of all maladies. And the stories in that, it's an example how you can learn, I find you can learn so much from a well-placed story, anecdote. Just the ones that come to mind, the way they used to do extremely radical breast surgery. And it was extraordinarily difficult to prove that that did more harm than good. It took decades. And women were disfiguring themselves. And it later came out that we know that by the time they're doing that radical surgery, generally they're all metastatic. It was already too late. So those disfigurements and those extremely painful surgeries were not doing any good. Another example is, the reason it's so direct is it really helps you think about data, particularly in medicine and biotech, was they had a drug for AIDS. And it also goes to the AIDS and things like that. And the drug was supposed to work, really good data. And they ran a trial, a really like kind of enough people, and it was like huge people over a number of years. It was powered to show a result, and it showed the drug failed. But actually it turned out many years later they figured out the drug worked. So what was happening is there was a nurse or a group of nurses, a patient would come in and every second person would get the drug. So they'd write it down, like it's like every odd number gets placebo, the even number gets a drug. And so what happened is very sick people were coming in, and the nurses, with the best of intentions, with the warmest hearts, were making sure that really sick people got given the drug. And so that's the double blind. That's the double bit of the blind. And it's just a really good example because that's obviously those acts of kindness set back the field by a number of years and caused all kinds of suffering and misfortune. And that's just they're just two examples of how the best possible intentions, like radical surgery, more is better, just cut it out. Do you want to do an extreme thing that might help, or do you just want to do nothing? And then an entire field of the smartest people go, okay, we'll have to do the extreme thing. We have to do something. Or similarly, I just want to help. It must be good to give the sick people the drug. That then caused vastly more suffering. There's just two examples, and draw that. So firstly, it teaches you a ton about double blind and the importance of data. And these are things you'll never know. There's no way in hell you can read an investor presentation, a scientific paper, and see something like that. That kind of data, we told them to do the data. It just doesn't exist. There's no way you can read that. No amount of work will get you to that. And similarly, you think, and obviously I know you're already probably figuring this out, compared to coronavirus, and the political response to that, and all kinds of other political responses we have to things. It's the impact, we don't know, it's scary, just do something, do the most radical thing, shut the borders, send the kids home, people can't go to funerals, you can't get married, just shut it all down, forget the fact that then that is a huge, as a mental harm, and it's 2 years of our life now. There's just this instinct inside us, just do something and just do the most radical thing when something really bad happens. And in one story, just in a couple of brief stories and vignettes that I gave you, you can just see how that instinct to help and do the most from the most, again, from the warmest possible place, from a place of love, of wanting to do the best thing by the most people, can lead to such disastrous outcomes. And there's so many examples of that. And so Emperor of All Maladies, good book, recommend.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. I mean, I think it's interesting that almost describes all medicine before 200 years ago or something, it was just, you do not want to have a limb sawn off or be bled or have leeches or whatever. And because, people just didn't know and they're just trying new stuff. And there's a great story. I think it's in Robin Hanson's book, The Elephant in the Brain. I forget the exact thing, but basically a king had some sort of malady, and he took his cleverest advisors, and they put together all these concoctions for him that just tasted awful and were terrible for him, but they had maximum visible impact because the whole thing was to signal and to demonstrate how clever they are and how much they care, and that these things have maximum impact. Because if they were just to prescribe sleeping or to just chill out a little bit and drink some water, that's not impressive, and that's not a demonstration of their capability. And so actually The Elephant in the Brain's a great book. on this entire subject, where it kind of points out, all these areas of life, from medicine to education to elsewhere, that basically we have these entire industries built around, just signaling, kind of divorced from any underlying function, which and so it's super interesting, and you can definitely see that.
Yeah, I was so upset with. I thought Gladys did a great job, but when she said one week, she said there's no evidence that whatever the measure was, sending kids home or playgrounds or something, and then the next week she did it, and it was like, you've literally demonstrated that that this doesn't help, and then you've gone and done it anyway. It was like, once people started, like, there was another one where they closed off the beaches, and I was like beside myself, firstly because you're locked at home, you can't go surfing, but secondly because like it's just a sign of irrationality. And once you see one of those signs, you just know you're in for like a world of pain. And that was 2 years ago, and it's exactly what happened.
It gets like, I get into like this murderous rage. I get really pissed. I mean, I won't reopen Pandora's box. My family had this quarantine thing, and I was quite vocal about how stupid a lot of these actions were. But the what really made me angry, to be honest, I was reading what was happening in Victoria, and I think there was like a family who had kind of contravened the rules, and they had done this gathering or whatever, and so the next day, the Premier announced that playgrounds were going to be shut from then on, and I
like
just
a punishment or something.
It's like he's punishing people that can't go to playgrounds. Like, this is totally divorced from pandemic management. This is purely vindictive, right? And so I don't know, like I want to like go riot in the streets. Like, that makes me want to burn things down. Like, who are you? Are you like a king? Like, you're just a bureaucrat.
You get a riot policeman punching you in the face. This is for your health and safety.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it was,
the fascinating thing is the Victorians support him. He's winning votes, and part of it is like, the thing that also annoyed me is I know a lot of very politically ambitious people, and these people, like, some of them want to be prime minister, whatever. I don't think they have any chance. Others of them literally have like 50-year plan. Like, they've mapped out each year of each decade almost. They're really thinking long term and strategically about how to do it, to the point where they'll say no to brilliant opportunities, in their early 20s, if they think it might affect them in their 50s. And I can see, like, whenever I see like politicians, I often see parts of these people in them, and I can see that they're just like creating a huge amount of political profit. It's a massively winning trade for them. They're benefiting. Someone like Dan Andrews, gone from nobody knowing him to being like a national figure who can determine who gets to work and who doesn't. He can control who plays where, who's allowed to leave their home and who's not. They've got this huge political power. It's almost like a currency, or it is like a currency. Another one I used to get annoyed about was bicycle helmets. So there's very weak evidence over bicycle helmets. Actually, you've got 3 children.
Yeah.
Did you consider, there's also this idea that Australia has a secret 2-child policy. And it's not just Australia, it's other countries where you force people to have particular child seats. And so what that ended up happening, it's actually very rare that, a seatbelt will cause more harm than good to a child. There will be a handful of instances a year where that's the case. But then a lot of families stop at 2 now because they'll have to buy a new car. They just can't fit the... Do you have any thoughts on that? Did you consider that?
I've definitely got thoughts. I mean, we abide by the laws, and we have the requisites. I've got 3, and they just fit in the back. But I think there's a study. I don't have the link on me, but you can kind of, I think Marginal Revolution, the blog, like Tyler Cowen posted the study a while back on that exact point, that basically car seat laws have the effect of like reducing fertility or limiting it to the 2, which is super interesting. I mean, I think like my thesis, and I haven't like looked into it, and so I don't really know is the short answer, but like I suspect like there's this whole big car seat conspiracy, and I'm not really kidding. Like, I think like these car seats are like enormously expensive. You're about to have a kid, like your kid's safety. You're not going to go cheap on your kid's safety, right? Like it's like the perfect situation, like the wedding industry. Just because for a wedding, suddenly it's 10x the price, because you want your day to be super special. I think it's the same thing with car seats. I suspect like something, with either it not being there, or with like 10x fewer features and costing, a fraction of the price, would have like the same effect. But no one like you have asymmetric payoffs as a politician. Why would you be the politician who kind of goes, we should have fewer car seats? Like it only ratchets up one way. And so similarly with COVID, the current premier seems to work in New South Wales, but like it feels like you have asymmetric payoffs being the tougher guy and kind of just going harder at the risk. There's a good book. I think it's called The Myth of the Rational Voter, by Brian Kaplan. Who I also read his Against Education, and he's got a pro-fertility book as well, which I recommend. And I don't know, like I've honestly, like the last 2 years, I'm increasingly just anti-democratic. Like I'm actually not sure this is working for all those reasons that.
Nah, I think democracy is the only way out. Eventually, people will turn against it, as basically happened in New South Wales, and I guess they're rioting in the streets. And I thought one word that you said that I thought was most interesting was ratchet, and that's actually how I view all these things. You can only go in one direction, and it's like, well, why don't you just do this crazy measure? It might help. You can't unwind that. You'll need to get somebody to get up and waste political, and this will be one of these people this will be one of these highly ambitious people that has like a 30-year plan to be prime minister, and they're on a 50-year plan, and then they're on like year 25, and you're going to get that person to go up and say, actually, we should make child seats smaller, which might be less safe, and then immediately there'll be advertisements of people arguing the opposite. It's a ratchet, one direction.
It's the same with any legislation. We are like if you read legislation from like 50 and certainly from like 100 years ago, like it's short and legible, and you and I can just kind of read it and we kind of get it. Today, it's like a textbook of legislation. Like 0% of politicians have read it, and it gets passed and it never goes away. And then you kind of get so you get like this enormous flourishing of like regulations, which no one knows how to abide by this stuff. This is Australia, this is especially bad in the US. And so you've got all these like libertarian types arguing for things like sunset clauses, which automatically so the legislation ends, or you can't introduce a new piece of legislation without replacing a former piece, because it's kind of all ratcheting in one direction, and it has the effect of executive rule, because there's so many laws and no one knows how to no one can kind of encompass all the laws in one mind or one institution. It becomes arbitrary because you can't enforce them all, so you enforce them as you like. And so it adds to this whole scleroticism. Like I at one point in the future, in 100 years, as we kind of look back and look at Aztec scleroticism, and like 30% of their working days were devoted to like religious ceremony and these fake wars of like for sacrifices. In the same way, we're going to look at today and go, like they're introducing textbooks of legislation that just mounted up regulations that no one knew or read what they are, and only ratcheted up one way. It's another one of those derangements that we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess it certainly leads to higher bureaucracy. And, there's a lot of like, COVID officers, all companies have hired people to manage their COVID policies. Every local government, every state government, they all have, there's a lot of people invested in this now. It's not going to go away politically.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did feel gloomy, we don't know how bad Omicron is or how you pronounce it. As we said, it looks fairly low symptoms, but maybe it's serious, maybe it's not. If it is a serious thing, and if it is vaccine resistant, imagine living in this world now where every 12, 18 months, whatever it is, there's a new hyper dangerous variant and people can't travel.
You know what it is, Misha, the key thing is it's not even going to be a variant. There's crazy flus all the time, swine flu. I remember that went through the world and everybody got it. It might even be coronavirus next time, it might be something else. But there's this precedent, there's scary new virus that you can lock people in their houses, cancel weddings, send kids home from school, shut playgrounds. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's very depressing.
Some of the governance crypto people, talk about this, and like we'll see where it goes. It's pretty nascent, but can you effectively exit the current institutional framework? Can you work together with online networks and communities around the world that have a lot of money and coordinate to buy tracts of land somewhere that will be amenable to their own governments and set up communities that kind of exit this madness? Now, like, it sounds a bit radical, but it has precedents. Singapore, Israel, in the past, Australia was a frontier nation that kind of got built, as a colony state, obviously, but then kind of transformed. So we're kind of living in a strange world where in the last 100 years we haven't built a new city in Australia or meaningfully in the US, which is just really strange. There's no law of God that said thou shalt have 5 cities. We have this enormous, beautiful coastline, infinite energy and food in this country, and we're just funneling everyone into like Sydney's western suburbs for some reason. So I'm actually optimistic that maybe Web3 or the kind of changes in the political zeitgeist will see more innovations around the types of communities and institutions we can build.
I think it's kind of like in business. Like, to set up a business, you need to have some moment of courage where you just go out and leap out and do it. And I feel like politics has the same kind of dynamic, in the sense that political space opens up, and yet somebody has to have the courage to do it. And funnily enough, they only need to do it once often to then make a name. So the New South Wales current premier, he strikes me as somebody like that. I think he believes it as well. There's a bit of luck that the political space opens up where you already are, which is kind of seems to be what happened with Trump. But in Dominic, there's now enough people angry about these policies that allowed him to then take that space. And then, to move on to your other point, it's people are now voting with their feet. Like, there's Melbourne, and then I can only talk to anecdote, but actually statistically, the population of Victoria is declining. People this year are going to think very hard over where they want to live. And within the United States, Miami, Texas, the places that are most free in that regard are going to attract more people, I think. And people around Australia, particularly if Sydney stays as the only major city with open borders internationally, people will slowly move here. And within Sydney, again, this is more anecdote than statistics, but I do know a lot of people are thinking very hard, I should be going up in, living in Byron Bay, living in Central Coast, going down to Wollongong, living on the South Coast. I think people will vote with their feet. So I don't think, you probably don't need like a new crypto state, but with time, these policies will impact what people do.
So I kind of agree. I mean, I thought a lot about this a couple of years ago when you had the Hong Kong protests ahead of the kind of Hong Kong annexation or whatever happened. And I thought, you know what, you've got millions of educated, wealthy, English-speaking folks who've come from a common law country. We shared the same highest court until 1975, I think it was. Like, we are bonded in many ways. Why wouldn't we build a new Hong Kong in Australia? Like, it kind of sounds weird and absurd. No one obviously spoke about it in any level of seriousness, but I wrote this essay and I kind of shared it, and it kind of catalyzed me having a podcast in life, because it kind of occurred to me that no one's talking about these kinds of things, and we used to be a frontier nation that did that kind of stuff. And so I'm very pro-migration. I think it's understated that Australia has the highest immigrant intake of any advanced nation. Almost 30% of Australians were born overseas, and yet right now it's just being funneled to like higher house prices.
Australia's, how old's Australia, Misha? It's about 120 years old, right? So 2 of those years, the most recent 2 years, we have not let international arrivals in.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? I'm not. Just putting it out there. This is a big period of time.
I totally agree.
And how does that affect? And then not letting people leave, not letting international people leave and go see their families, which was cruelty. Like, there's literally no logical reason for that. Full stop. That was madness. It's irrational. What impact does that have on our status as a migrant nation going forward?
Like, don't even get me started on that. Like, as I said, I wrote an article for USA Today on this. Like, I was born in Georgia, former Soviet Union, and I kind of grew up on stories of the Union, and so my family and my cousins and like emigrated in the Soviet waves that were let out of the Soviet Union in the Jewish the Soviet waves, because you couldn't leave the Soviet Union. These are closed political systems because they break if people can exit. And here I am sitting in Sydney, in Australia, in this country I admire deeply and I'm deeply grateful for, and I think it's probably the best country in the world. And suddenly, alone in the world, it suddenly bans exit. And something broke for me. Like suddenly, I look at the Australian polity differently. And I mean, again, this is one of those derangements that we were kind of talking about earlier. And I think Australians kind of take it in stride. I don't really know why, but I thought two things were like totally outrageous. One, banning exit, like I think it's just like unconscionable. And secondly, banning Australians from coming back in. There was that period where if you're like if you'd been in India, it's like a $1 gazillion fine for you to come back in as an Australian citizen. Rather than you can't imagine Israel doing that. Israel did the opposite. It sent planes out, took its citizens back to its country, appropriate quarantine, which I think is appropriate, and appropriate precautions, which I think is totally appropriate. But what use is your Australian passport and citizenship and membership of this great country that we have here if Australia and Australians just tell you to fuck off, at their whim? It just totally, it's sick in my view.
Just fear just took over. It was fear in the population that led to political, and then there was political fear in the politicians that they would not do the right thing and lose power. And it's very disheartening to see.
I actually feel pessimistic. Like in 2019, as I said, I kind of, in the shouting into the void, like no one's listening to me. I'm not like a figure of at all, but I kind of suggested, why don't we have more of a frontier mentality? Why are we building new cities? We can do this. We choose not to do this. And then as kind of COVID hit us and we, retreated into the pettiest of mindsets, I kind of realized why. Like, I don't think there's political will, capability, institutional capability to deal with those kinds of questions. I think we just kind of steady as she goes, and I hope that changes. And I obviously hope this country can do great things, but I did downgrade my assessment of what we're capable of.
I'd have to agree. I think your opinion. I think everybody's opinion on politics had to change. Like the way we thought about in Australia, the way we thought about state politics, the power that was vested in them, the fact that the state could control basically every aspect of your life, whether you're allowed to work, whether you're allowed to leave, whether your kids could go to school, whether you could take them to a playground in the afternoon. Politics always seemed something like ambitious kids did. In England actually, where I spent university, it was more real. Like it was like communism and like, we beat it's like, it was all these huge like global movements. In Australia, politics never seemed that relevant. It was just something, annoying and ambitious people did. And occasionally impacted your life, but that all changed the last 2 years. It was like literally every aspect of your life was all of a sudden governed by the state. That was pretty scary.
The best thing that I've consumed on politics recently was an interview with Dominic Cummings, who helped Boris with Brexit and his election recently. Andrew Sullivan's podcast, he interviewed Dominic Cummings, and I could not recommend this podcast more. Basically said, he walked through his thinking about, Boris and leaving Boris and ultimately why Brexit, how that worked. But, he basically said, you'll be surprised at just what absolute shambles and how total chaos it is behind the curtain of politics, and like no one's in charge and no one knows what's going on. And I think that's like generally true. I do wonder whether there's a growing adverse selection problem with politics in Australia and overseas, where smart guys like you are going to finance and raising funds, and or startups or tech or other places. And so like, who here is really joining politics? Like, what kind of person do you have to be to persevere through like decrepit job requirements of like a state or federal politician? Like, there's got to be just raw, unabated ambition for power and like power hunger, and like willing to sacrifice family and lifestyle and absolutely everything in the service of that. And like, I wonder, like obviously, how good can that possibly be?
Yeah, I can kind of see the ambition. Like I can almost get in the head of somebody ambitious enough to do that. But I was at a weird part. I graduated at a weird time where finance it was like the end of finance being cool. Like the smart kids did com law and then were desperate to get investment banking. You would have been the same generation.
Yeah, same
It was
thing.
investment banking or consulting. You know that like 2 or 3 years later, it would have been different. It would have been computer science, coding, development. And I think that would have been, most smart people would have been much happier going down that path and probably made a lot more money. And instead of, launching funds and creating financial models and doing really good transactional stuff, which is heaps of fun, they might have been building products and going in different directions. The same kids, just a few years later. And then now you're kind of like 10, 15 years later beyond that. Now they all seem to be obsessed about crypto. So take from that. Maybe it's like what the smart, yeah, it's an interesting one.
I totally agree. I mean, I did com law and I went to investment banking and then private equity. So like, I totally get that. And
no one seems to want to do that anymore. It's not what they're aspiring to. They're aspiring to launch cryptocurrency or actually media is much more of a thing. So to be a YouTuber, to be a podcaster, going into media is much more realistic for anyone. I imagine a lot of kids would know people who've been successful, just with something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I could had real skills, so to speak. I mean, I can, like in terms of building products and the like, I reckon if people are actually doing more of that, like, I mean, I think there's just a structural dearth. Like I was into some Sequoia investor and he was saying they're like, actually, I'm gonna bungle the number, but there's some ridiculously small number of actual devs in the world, and like it's a structural undersupply.
Actually build things.
And to actually do that, and so I think that'd be in terms to actually realize your ambitions and do that. I reckon. I mean, to be honest, I love investing, but to be able to build things, I reckon that'd be pretty fun.
Also, I definitely went through a period where I was like pretty critical of finance. I was actually working in finance at the time, but it was kind of like, you're just trading with other people. But then I think as I get older, especially now I see companies being formed, I see them raise money, I see the difference it takes to and I see that how important it is that the right companies get the money. Like the most successful societies, whether it was like, and again, I'm not saying these societies were perfect, but Britain 200 or 300 to 100 years ago, or America, in the more recent era, they had extremely well developed financial systems. And Silicon Valley, what makes Silicon Valley? To me, it's the fact there are so many people willing to give kids millions of dollars to build something and see if it works. Like that activity, that willingness to speculate, that willing to invest, that willing to take huge amounts of risk. To me, that makes Silicon Valley, it kind of makes America. And societies often seem to succeed and fail as to whether they're willing to do that. Will you give a group of smart young people who are driven, will the old rich people fund that happily and then lose money, write it off and do it again and again and again?
I think it's an interesting question.
You actually feel proud to be part of that in some tiny little way, to be honest.
Oh, I think we are living through another industrial age, like revolution. And I think it's enormously exciting. I think there is an interesting question. How do you replicate that special environment that Silicon Valley had, that that existed during the Renaissance and Paris a little bit later? And I think it goes back to, I don't know what the answer is at all, but I think part of it goes back to what you were saying before earlier around what's a high status activity. And, in Silicon Valley, a high status activity was not like making a gazillion bucks and driving Ferraris. It was being a freak who said no to $1 billion acquisition, and you're trying to they would
build something.
So, there was a unique set of social cues and status arrangements that really thrust people to do great things, and so I do not.
Funding matters. Like in the Renaissance,
and funding matters absolutely. Yeah,
it became the status thing was to have a top amazing artwork done. So the wealthy people there funded commissions for a whole generation of artists.
Well, funding matters. I mean, a lot of crypto comes back to just a funding model. It's slightly different to the status question, but can creators have capture more of the value and increase the pie through going direct to their listeners? And so in one respect, it's all just a rearrangement, and it's all just kind of bullshit because the music's the same and the listeners are the same, and it's all kind of in between. But that business model and that tech just enables dramatically different flow of wealth and economics. And so
status is a really good lens to use that. Because, for example, what does it mean if you have a Bored Ape or a crypto punk? It means firstly that you're deadly serious about crypto, like you're immediately sending that signal. Either you're there right at the start, or you've invested a huge amount of money, and either way, you currently have a huge amount of money invested in a tiny little in a JPEG. You're already signaling that, and that creates a lot of value. You look at these things, you're like, I kind of want one of these things. Like forget having a Rolex, like a 50 grand or 30 grand watch. How much Rolexes are on your wrist? How about a $500,000 like ape that signals your seriousness about crypto? Like that is today's society is far more appealing. You can kind of get it. You can use that status lens.
And the status signals of younger generations are dramatically different to older ones. Like this morning, just randomly, I was reading about another gentleman's club in Melbourne or whatever. Like are they going to admit women or not? And I just thought, like, irrespective of the arguments, I just thought, who gives a shit? Like I can't imagine any of my mates wanting to join one. I don't know if you're a member of like the Australia Club or something, but like. But like I imagine, and I've got nothing against that.
Not that I want to rule it out in the future. Should anyone be?
Should anyone be listening? But and maybe I'm just in the wrong circles. But like
club group of men, I don't know. Maybe it's better to have a few girls there.
Yeah, I mean, no, irrespective of the gender thing, like I can't imagine for us it being a sign of status in 20 years that would go to lunch, in this club. You know what I mean? I reckon having, to your point, having a Bored Ape or like being a part of a particular DAO or something is like more likely to kind of convey that kind of status that
and funny enough, let's say you're a developer, everything you do, everything you develop, every project you participate with, that's visible forever. And it's not just on the blockchain where you can see it there potentially, but also, your production history, your GitHub, all those kinds of things. Like that's valuable. You can't fake that.
Anything else we should chat about before we wrap up? I've really enjoyed this conversation, by the way. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, mate, this has been great. Let's wrap up there. I thought that's pretty broad. It was great to come on. Thanks so much, Misha. Really appreciate it. And let's catch up again soon in person.
Awesome. It was a lot of fun. Look forward to a coffee or a beer.
Sounds good. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Bye.